Good morning. The committee will come to order. Today we will separately consider 4 health care measures, 2 repealing portions of the Democrats' health care law, and 2 advancing new opportunities to lower costs and increase flexibility for health care consumers. The repeal provisions target 2 of the taxes in the law, the medical device tax and the ban on using health-related savings accounts for over-the-counter medication. Both of these bills have bipartisan support from members on and off the committee, and so I am hopeful we'll advance them in a bipartisan manner today. Today, we will also take steps to spur greater flexibility of health-related savings accounts, specifically, though, through needed improvements to health savings accounts and flexible spending arrangements. Given that most recent HSA census shows over 13.5 million Americans were enrolled in an HSA in 2011, an increase of nearly 2 million in the last year. It's clear that HSAs are becoming an increasingly attractive option for consumers. Additionally, with more than 33 million people enrolled in an FSA, there's more reason than ever to ensure that consumers have the utmost flexibility in using these accounts to meet their health care needs. As these provisions are championed by a number of members of this committee, I'll forego my usual opening statement. I will now recognize Mr. Paulson on the medical device tax legislation, then Ms. Jenkins on OTC, followed by Dr. Bustani on FSAs and Chairman Herger on HSAs. Mr. Paulson, you're recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing today. The United States has led the global medical device industry for decades, and this leadership has brought hundreds of thousands of high-paying jobs to our country, as well as life-saving and life-improving devices to our nation's patients. The United States medical device industry employs over 423,000 Americans in good, rewarding jobs that pay higher than average salaries. More than 80% of medical device companies are small businesses employing 50 people or less. This could all change with the implementation of the new medical device tax that will hit on January 1st, 2013. This tax on American innovation will push research and development and manufacturing abroad and put tens of thousands of American jobs at risk. Small startup companies will be hit especially hard because the tax will be levied regardless of profitability. We must pass the Protect Medical Innovation Act and repeal this ill-conceived tax, which will increase health care costs, reduce patient access to new technologies, and cost us hundreds of thousands of American jobs. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Jenkins, you're recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Healthcare reform must be focused on increasing personal options and accessibility to care, not limiting them. Unfortunately, many facets of the President's healthcare law were unable to live up to this simple premise. One of the most glaring violations is the onerous restriction the healthcare takeover placed on over-the-counter medications. According to the healthcare law, if an American wants to use their health or flexible savings account to purchase an over-the-counter drug like Advil, cough syrup, or Claritin, they would need to first receive a prescription from their doctor. Over 19 million Americans have used HSAs or FSAs over the past 10 years, and 90% of physicians and pharmacists recommend their patients self-treat with OTC medicines before seeing a doctor. A recent study found that OTC medicines contribute a total of $102 billion in savings and cost avoidance to the healthcare system each year. That means for every $1 spent on OTC medicines, the healthcare system saves between $6 and $7. The President's OTC restrictions make no sense medically or fiscally. There's broad bipartisan and bicameral support, and I look forward to advancing this measure. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Dr. Bustani, you are recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman Camp, for considering H.R. 1004, the Medical FSA Improvement Act, bipartisan legislation I introduced with my colleague, Congressman John Larson. Our legislation will help lower health care costs by making it easier for Americans to plan and save for health care needs using flexible spending arrangements, or FSAs. These accounts allow Americans to set aside pre-tax dollars to pay for rising out-of-pocket medical expenses. About 35 million Americans rely on FSAs, and the median salary of FSA enrollees is $55,000. Our bill will make FSAs easier to use by reforming Treasury's use it or lose it policy. This policy discourages enrollment in FSAs by forcing workers to forfeit any of their remaining FSA funds to an employer at the end of the year. Our bill, as modified in this amendment, will allow workers to cash out a remaining end-of-year balance of up to $500, treating it as taxable compensation. patients and families need relief from rising health care costs. FSAs can help tens of millions more individuals if the so-called use it or lose it rule were reformed. I urge our colleagues to support this bill. And I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Herger, you're recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman Camp. Millions of Americans receive affordable health coverage through high-deductible health plans paired with health savings accounts. This year, 13.5 million Americans are enrolled in high-deductible plans, an 18% increase over 2011. Furthermore, a recent RAND study found that if half of all employees were enrolled in HSA plans, health care costs could be reduced by $57 billion annually. H.R. 5858, the HSA Improvement Act, streamlines HSA rules to make these plans more accessible to low and middle-income Americans, veterans, married couples, and early retirees. I urge the committee to approve this legislation so more Americans can enjoy the benefits of health care savings.
Thank you very much. Before I yield to the ranking member for any statement he wishes to make, I ask that all member opening statements be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. Mr. Levin.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Republicans are now returning to a familiar foil, again resurrecting their attack on health care reform. And overall, the legislation presents two fundamental questions. How will the majority offset the costs? And second, are these bills the best use of scarce federal dollars in a time of fiscal austerity? I am deeply concerned that these bills cost nearly $42 billion. It is simply unacceptable for the majority not to pay for them. It is equally unacceptable that they have not told us how they plan to pay for these bills if they intend to do so. I think it is deceitful to talk about deficits and not pay for bills costing $42 billion. I am troubled that the committee is considering these four bills before we focus on fixing the pending nearly 27% cut to Medicare physician payments. The doc fix would cost about $20 to $25 billion for a one-year fix, which is much less for a much more pressing issue than the nearly $42 billion before us today. The Republicans continue their attempt to repeal health care reform without a replacement. If their solution is expanded access to flexible savings accounts and health savings accounts, then it falls far short of the needs of American families. Neither FSAs nor HSAs provide comprehensive health care coverage to participants. They are not real solutions to the problems facing our health care system. In contrast, ACA will expand comprehensive health coverage to over 30 million Americans, and will guarantee access to affordable comprehensive coverage for tens of millions of Americans who currently have health coverage. One of the bills before us today helped ensure that health reform was fully paid for and will not add to the deficit. The repeal of the medical device excise tax would cost almost $30 billion, making up the majority of the cost before us today. The medical device industry is quite profitable and stands to gain millions of new customers through health care reform. And in 2009, this industry stood with President Obama at the White House and pledged, in quotes, to do our part to make health reform a reality. I have a copy of this letter. The first signature on this letter is the President and CEO of Advanced Medical Technology Association, along with other industry trade associations. That association committed to working to find $2 trillion in health care savings. The medical device excise tax is the industry's contribution to health reform, just as all the other sectors contributed in recognition of the fact that they stood to benefit from 30 million new customers. Some have charged that the excise tax will encourage device manufacturers to ship jobs overseas. That is not true. Devices made in the U.S. and exported for use abroad will not be subject to the excise tax. And importantly, devices made and imported abroad and imported for use in the U.S. will be subject to the excise tax, period. All devices used in the U.S. will be subject to this tax, even if they are made abroad. I would now like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Connecticut to speak on 10,004.
I thank Ranking Member Levin, and I thank Dr. Bustani, and I'm proud of the work with Chairman Camp previously on FSAs. I want to be clear that I view these as a supplement, but a very important supplement to working families in the middle class, people that face health care issues and recognize whether it's diabetes, whether it's autism, whether it's allergies, or whether it's planning for those contingencies in a health care system that if you're prudent and save for, you can use tax dollars to do it. I commend the $500 cap because I think it makes more scorable. But I would also say that our whole scoring system, and I hope we can work with the majority on this, because as we go to the floor, and I am concerned that this bill is juxtaposed against eliminating the Affordable Health Care Act, but nonetheless, I think this is important legislation that bipartisanly can be worked on to provide benefits for the middle class. And between the Sheldon Whitehouse panel, where he came up with efficiencies that can be calculated, between the Reuters document that came out with over $700 billion in savings, and also, industry reports that Mr. Levin just alluded to, we ought to be able to find the money in a reasonable, practical way, and I look forward to working with Mr. Bustani and Mr. Camp to achieve that.
Thank you very much. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 436, the Protect Medical Innovation Act of 2011. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I will now turn to Tom Barthold, Chief of Staff to the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. I'd ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Levin, members. The descriptive documents for the underlying bill and the amendment before you are JCX 45 and JCX 50. In short, under present law, effective for sales after December 31st of this year, an manufacturer's excise tax of 2.3% will be imposed upon the sale of any taxable medical device by a manufacturer or importer. Generally speaking, taxable medical devices are those used in a medical institution or by medical professionals. They are not those that are regularly available for purchase by individual consumers, such as at a retail pharmacy. The proposal before you would repeal the medical device excise tax and would be effective upon the date of enactment.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Mr. Paulson's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I already made the opening statement, but I do want to emphasize that the medical technology is truly an American success story, and I can say that coming from a state like Minnesota, where we have the highest per capita employment in medtech. And between 1980 and 2000, this is an industry whose work has extended life expectancy by more than 3 years in a 20-year time frame. At the same time, we've seen the death rate from heart disease decrease by a stunning 50% and the death rate cut from stroke by 30%. And this is a new medical device tax that is going to create an environment that will harm American innovation in this industry that has allowed life-saving and life-improving technologies to move forward. And although this tax has not yet gone into effect, it is already having consequences and costing this country high-paying jobs. There are at least 3 major companies that have already announced that they are laying off thousands of workers in anticipation of the tax, and it hasn't even taken place yet. And while the United States is still a net exporter of these devices, our lead has dramatically shrunk over the last decade, largely due in part to our tax rates here in the United States, as well as a lower R&D tax credit compared to our competitor nations. And so, Mr. Bartold, I do want to ask you, because this tax, I think, is particularly harmful because it is levied on sales, not on profits, regardless if a company is profitable or not. And taxing sales disproportionately does affect startups who tend to invest heavily in research and development. And 80% of device companies are small businesses, fewer than 50 employees. This tax will have a devastating effect to their bottom lines. Mr. Bartold, can you just explain a little bit how an excise tax operates? Who ends up bearing the effective burden of the tax?
Thank you, Mr. Paulson. Excise tax is imposed upon, in this case, upon the sales price of the piece of equipment in question. It is not based on income, so it acts the same as a retail sales tax, except that it's on one specific good or one specific class of goods. As to the question of economic incidence, that in any market comes down to factors of supply and demand. I think we generally, economists generally think that over the longer run, excise taxes will tend to be borne by the consumer, so higher prices for the good upon purchase. In this particular market, there may be some mitigation to that because there's significant purchases of some of the devices by Medicare, which is under a more price-regulated system. So, in fact, it can be the case that some of the burden of the tax is borne by the manufacturer. An additional effect is that you would expect, by making the price higher, that future sales, or at least the growth of future sales, would be damped compared to what it would be in the absence of any taxation. I hope that addresses your question, Mr. Paulson.
And Mr. Bartold, then, would you expect health care costs to increase due to the medical device tax?
As an overall measure, it should have some small, to the extent that the tax is passed forward to consumers, makes the price of devices, and so the price of providing certain services involving the devices more expensive. Devices are a not insignificant, but a modest part of overall health care costs, so there should be some upward effect on the price of health care services.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, just noting that there are 239 co-sponsors of this legislation, bipartisan support. I anticipate we'll be able to move it through and hopefully successfully on the House floor as well. But I do want to point out that in addition to its effects on jobs and the economy, the medical device tax is going to stunt medical innovation. And as the population is aging, a tax on new innovative treatments and healthcare solutions is going to slow medical advancement and put the health of our citizens more at risk. And put simply, this is going to be a tax that will stifle the ability to create new life-saving and life-improving products that has created this American success story. With that, I will yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Levin's recognized for 5 minutes.
First of all, I'd like to ask that the letter of May 11, 2009 that I referred to, signed by the President and CEO of Advanced Medical Technology Association and other AMA, et cetera, be placed in the record.
Without objection.
You know, it's really mind-boggling that we come forth and talk about the impact of a tax on consumers when there's no plan in this committee to pay for this bill, which is the major cost item among the four by far. I just find it, as I said, so inconsistent, and I think it's deceitful. Just so the record's clear, Mr. Bartold, this tax would apply to devices wherever they're constructed, wherever they're manufactured?
Mr. Levin, that's correct. It follows sort of the standard Internal Revenue Code excise tax model. Products that are exported are exempt. imports are subject to tax upon importation.
All right, now, there's been some, by the way, one of the manufacturers is in Michigan, and they're fairly profitable. And if we're simply provincial about these bills, we'll never pass anything. Now, there's some thought that that this tax would kill or very much undermine the device industry. Mr. Bartow, you've looked at this. Give us your view, including the impact on there being, under health care reform, millions more covered by insurance. Could you comment on those who talk about this tax killing or destroying an industry?
Well, I won't characterize anything as killing or destroying. I'll try and just briefly summarize some of the economic incentives. As I noted in responding to Mr. Paulson, if an excise tax, by increasing prices, should have the effect of discouraging some future purchases. Now, relative to the baseline, and as was noted by a couple of the members already, the industry has been growing. There are other forces, such as the aging of population, which is increasing demand for some of the taxed products. So our analysis is that the industry will continue to grow, but an excise tax means it won't grow quite as quickly as it would in the absence of the tax.
And would it continue to grow in part because of new persons covered by health insurance?
Increase in access to use of the devices, and if expanding health coverage or other means led to increased access, that would increase demand for devices absent any tax or other changes in policy.
Thank you.
Mr. Neal is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by saying I think this is a terrific industry, very important to Massachusetts, and I helped to negotiate this agreement over the objections of some of my own leadership. We knocked this tax down from 5% to 2.3%, and by and large, the industry subscribed to the final product. The difficulty here, and I would note something that Mr. Paulson said that I think is very important. He said the aging component of the actuarial discussion means that there are going to be 30 million new customers under the Affordable Care Act, potentially for these medical devices. Now, Mr. Bartholomew, how do we know what we're exactly paying with device reimbursements as they're tangled in bundled payments?
I don't know that I'm going to be able to answer your question very well, Mr. Neal. I'm not expert in Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement policies.
But the emphasis is here on the question Mr. Paulson raised about the aging population. We would all agree that they distort the actuarial reality of the allocation of health care services in America. Isn't that correct?
Well, again, I'm not expert on that aspect. I mean, the point that I did make in answer both to Mr. Levin and Mr. Paulson was that there are many economic forces that are driving demand for devices, and one of them is the aging of population is increasing demand for those devices. So if that's what you're asking, I do concur with that.
That's a satisfactory yes. Thank you. And my point is here that this is an effort to fracture the agreement that was reached. And Mr. Chairman, let me say this to you. If Republicans came up with a reasonable substitute for paying for this, I think that our position would be to buy in. The difficulty is that this was negotiated, it was transparent, it was fully vetted day upon day, And there was an opportunity during the discussion on the House floor to fully go through all of these items. And to come back to this topic now without a pay-for makes it difficult for those of us to take the challenge that is being offered by the majority here seriously. I understand trying to score political points in this atmosphere. But the reality is, in full public view, this issue was vetted. It was entirely transparent. And the industry, by and large, bought in. One other caveat that was really a critical part of this discussion: as long as the tax was to be applied to foreign competition, that was the bottom line from the industry. We bought that position.
Thank you. I would just say that the argument about pay-for is really appropriate on the floor. As you know, House rules do not require that we identify a pay-for at the committee level. The committee level is really to discuss the policy and the effect of what this tax increase on high-tech manufacturing particularly is going to do. And let me just say that, you know, there really is no windfall in the health care bill for the medical device industry. You know, unlike hospitals and doctors, they don't sell directly to the public. And let me just finish. I mean, but they don't control the flow of patients to them. That's done by the physician community. But let me just say, most patients who, my understanding is, who suffer ailments receive these devices without regard to whether they're covered by insurance. And particularly elderly patients use the majority of these medical devices. And they're already covered under Medicare. So this idea that there's some windfall out there that the medical device community is receiving from the health care bill. The biggest increase in coverage because of the individual mandate in the health care law is going to be the young. And the young and healthy population use very few of these medical devices. Now, because this tax is based on gross sales, as has been pointed out by a couple of people, rather than net sales, you know, a company has to pay this even if they're losing money. And unfortunately, we had a tax like this in Michigan that we've been trying to get rid of for 30 years, finally did get rid of it, but they pay this tax. So this really isn't a tax to recoup profits because they have to pay it anyway. And so the idea that there's some windfall that we have to recoup profits from this particular sector, I think is you know, not really logically following what this current law does to this industry. But let me just say, if it does lead to higher profits for this industry, their taxes will go up. And as we have the highest corporate tax rate in the world now in the United States, they will pay more in taxes to the government, and the government will collect an additional share of that revenue. So I would just say, because arguing that somehow the medical device industry needs to pay their fair share because of this influx of people under the health care law, I don't think makes logical sense.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, I'll be happy to yield to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, that's the way this committee once operated, that many of these negotiations were done in full public view, and industry sacrificed, labor sacrificed in order to find a common path or a common ground forward. Now, would you agree that it's the tangle of the bundled payment system that keeps us from really understanding what some of these costs are?
Well, there certainly are a lot of problems with that, as we know.
And I mean, if we could kind of decipher that, I think that it would be very helpful, instead of positioning the argument that we currently are. And lastly, are we to be able to say that we guarantee that there will be a pay-for on the House floor?
Well, obviously, I'm not going to make that sort of statement at committee. I never have, never will. But the point on that issue is more appropriate for the House floor, I think, than in committee.
Would the gentleman yield?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Look, a requirement is one thing, Mr. Chairman, but that doesn't mean we don't have an obligation to come up in this committee with pay-fors. It's not required under the rules, but it's a dereliction of our duties not to consider pay-fors, especially if they're within the jurisdiction of this committee, number one. Number two, nobody's talking about a windfall. What we're talking about is there will be more and more people who will be covered by health care. And one of the reasons these groups essentially said they were going to participate in helping to pay for health care reform was that they were going to be participants in expanded health care coverage. And whatever the percentage is in terms of medical devices, look, a lot of these medical devices are used by people who aren't covered by Medicare. There's going to be expanded use of medical devices as part of health care reform. And good old capitalist principles are that when there are more customers, it makes it more feasible for you to develop your product and make a profit. It's not a windfall. It's the impact of expanded health care coverage, and that's why they signed this letter. And as Mr. Neo said, they participated. They weren't coerced. And now, essentially, what you're doing is giving a pass to people who participated and obliged themselves to participate, and without paying for it.
I think we'll move on. I'm not sure how volitional any letters signed in the context of the health care law really were by any of the groups that were involved, but I'll yield 5 minutes to Mr. Herger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to follow up on some of the points that you were just making. We're all aware we're in the longest period of economic downturn, recession, since the Great Depression. And many feel that a lot of the reason that we're not creating jobs, that we're not moving forward, is because of many of the challenges we have within our tax code and our tax system. And Mr. Bartholt, I represent California, and one of the things we're proud of in our state is that we have a strong culture of innovative startup businesses, which in turn grow jobs. Whether it's in computers, energy, biotechnology, or medical devices, the entrepreneurs who launch these startups have to take a considerable amount of upfront risk. Even if they're able to bring a product to market relatively early, it often takes several years before they begin to really see a return on their investment. Does the excise tax on medical device manufacturers apply to companies that do not show a profit on their tax return, or does it only apply to companies that operate in the black?
Mr. Herger, as explained, it is not an income tax, it's an excise tax, so it's on the sales value of the product.
So we're talking about a greater cost that's there regardless of whether they're turning a profit or not. So in other words, a new innovative startup company that is losing money in early years will be required to come up with the money to pay this tax on its sales.
Mr. Herger, that would in part depend again on the point that we made about what the ultimate economic incidence is. To the extent that it can be passed forward to the consumer, of course, the sales revenue would compensate for the tax, but it may not in all cases be able to be 100% passed on to the consumer, sir.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Becerra is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthold, actually, before I begin to ask you a question, I think sometimes we forget that we're talking to each other, and a lot of folks who may have a chance to watch these hearings don't understand sometimes what we mean by all the acronyms that are used and the terms that are often employed. Medical devices. Some folks may not understand that a medical device could be eyeglasses, or it could be an X-ray machine, or an MRI. Medical devices include any number of things. And so when we talk about medical devices, I think most of us recognize that without this industry that has produced so many of the so much of the equipment and devices that have helped Americans live out a fruitful life, that we would be in real trouble. So I think we first have to recognize that this is an industry that is indispensable to Americans' health. At the same time, let me make sure we're clear on something. The excise tax that we're talking about doesn't apply to all medical devices, correct?
That's correct, sir.
So eyeglasses, those don't fall within that.
That's correct.
Hearing aids don't fall within the tax.
That's correct. As I tried to note very, very briefly, things that are regularly available but for purchase by individual consumers are excluded from the tax base.
And so and I think if I can interpret what you're saying, if I walk into a grocery store, if I can find a particular medical device in a grocery store, reading glasses, I'm not going to pay that additional amount in the excise tax as a consumer.
I wouldn't say 100%, but most anything that you could find in a retail pharmacy shelf would be excluded from the tax base, sir.
Thanks for that clarification. But hip replacement, the implant, a knee implant replacement, those types of things do fall within
those specific items would be taxable under the statute as in effect.
And they are devices, they are equipment, they are things that make life easier and work better for Americans. So again, we recognize the importance of it. What is the cost of this bill?
Mr. Becerra, that's reproduced on the bottom of JCX 50. Our estimate of the 10-year cost is $29 billion.
$29 billion. And there is no pay for at this stage in that bill.
As the chairman had noted earlier.
Right. So there's no pay for.
Not in this not in this bill, sir.
So if this bill were to go all the way through and become law, it would add $29 billion to the deficit.
As we currently estimate for the 10-year period.
And are you aware of any pay for that's been brought to your attention to help cover the cost of the $29 billion?
Well, Mr. Becerra, as you know, member offices send in requests to me all the time, and we don't comment on those. Okay. So it's up to the members to decide how to address those broad issues.
So this is legislation that adds $29 billion to the deficit. It is a $29 billion cost that was a provision in the landmark health legislation that passed to help cover the cost of expanding and improving health care for all Americans. And it was one of the ways that we paid for the legislation so that we would not add to the deficit. If you now remove this portion, you now add to the deficit, or certainly you make it more difficult to cover the cost of improving health care for all Americans. And while we could do this bit by bit, chunk by chunk, we could certainly find a lot of different ways to avoid asking one sector or an industry or one group of Americans to not have to pay for the landmark health reform that made health care more affordable for Americans. But at the same time, then, you are undermining the ability of all Americans to be able to partake in what will be far better health care through the landmark reform. Since you're not aware of the pay for, I guess my question won't go to you. I'll just leave it out there. Could we end up finding, if it is paid for, that we pay, this Congress decides to pay for it through cuts to Medicare? Or if it's not paid for at all, then it just adds to the deficit, which later on we'll have to pay for through increasing taxes on someone else or cutting essential services, Medicare, Social Security for someone else. And so I think while most of us would agree that it'd be great to be able to find ways to please everyone, if we're going to do this together, then we have to understand that everyone should partake. And so, Mr. Chairman, at this stage, without knowing what to pay for it makes it difficult for folks to proceed.
I yield back. The gentleman's time has expired. Dr. Bustani is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the over 30 years of my time in medical education and subsequently practicing medicine in cardiovascular surgery, which is one of the most technically advanced and rapidly advancing fields in all of medicine, I can tell you that I have seen firsthand, year after year, month after month, new technology that has come on board that has not only saved lives, but has actually reduced the actual cost of health care over time. And if you really look at the real dynamic nature of the healthcare economy, you begin to understand what these advances really do, from stents and artificial joints and these kinds of things that have remarkably advanced, not only quality for so many Americans and people around the world, but really actually lower the cost if you really look at this in a comprehensive way. Now, this tax gives me a great deal of heartburn, and if you look at how the reimbursement structure is set up in healthcare to address Mr. Neal's concerns about bundling, everything, all the reimbursements in healthcare from Medicare and Medicaid all the way down through private insurance are basically a cost control regime. It's fixed. It's fixed at either Medicare or some multiple of Medicare. And so this device tax adds cost to the innovation, which then gets passed on to the hospital, which, or the other purchaser, perhaps a physician clinic, but the reimbursement is fixed and oftentimes doesn't meet the cost. So either under any circumstance, you're going to see cost increases in healthcare or a decline in innovation, some combination of the two, depending on the circumstances. Now, Mr. Barthold, I have a basic question. I know joint tax does not advocate for policy or advocate for any particular policies, but I do know that you have some insights as to the economic rationale behind this tax. And I'd like to understand your insights on the economic rationale behind this tax, and how was that 2.3% figure chosen? Why wasn't it 5% or 1% or 0.5%? Give us some indications on that.
Mr. Bustani, I don't think I can really answer your question. Actually, Mr. Neal before indicated that there were negotiations and that there had been a proposal to have a tax of this sort at 5%, and that as a result of discussion among members, a tax rate of 2.3% was chosen. I don't know anything.
But do you know of any rationale for this kind of tax? I think it's pretty clear that it's going to raise the cost of health care. It's going to have some stifling effect on innovation. And if we're looking at American competitiveness, and especially healthcare, which is has been a growing field with job creation, a field where was an economic sector of our economy that was relatively recession-proof. Recession-proof. And now we're seeing it subjected to recessionary forces. I mean, what's the economic rationale behind this kind of tax?
Well, again, Mr. Bustani, it was part of as was noted, a broader package of policy changes which were debated by members at that time. I don't have a separate rationale.
So it was a pay-for for a very expensive, for a very expensive bill. But I mean, I'm just asking for your economic expertise in the field of taxation. What's the rationale for something like this?
It's not I can't offer a rationale per se, sir. I can't tell you, as we discussed a little bit already. The excise, the industry is growing. Under the baseline, we project that the industry will grow. Now, the recession has tended to damp all growth across a lot of industries. This industry included. Under the tax, when it comes into effect, we still project that the industry will grow, but at a smaller pace.
Is that a good thing?
At a lower pace.
Is that a desirable thing to see an industry that should be growing and creating jobs and creating innovation, developing innovative techniques that promote health and quality? Do we want to douse that?
Well, in almost all choices we make in taxation that the committee has to make, there are trade-offs between what happens to growth, efficiency, fairness, simplicity, and it's really up for the members to make the decision.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Time's expired. Mr. Kynes recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, let me just preface my remarks by echoing what Mr. Paulson, Mr. Neal said previously, that I believe the medical device industry is an incredibly important industry for our country. It's one of the major manufacturers that is growing. I have many large and small these device manufacturers in Wisconsin and the upper Midwest. They do have a tremendous economic impact, and therefore I'm very sympathetic for finding different ways of paying for the Affordable Care Act other than using a measure like this And I've always said from the beginning that if we can find some reasonable offsets to replace this medical device excise tax, I'm open to that, and I'm fair game. But it is troublesome that we're moving forward with another markup in a provision that helps pay for health care reform without talking about any offsets, without talking about any alternatives. And our ranking member, Mr. Levin, is right, that this should be more vetted in the committee so we can explore the consequences of alternative offsets rather than waiting for the 11th hour, throwing it on the House floor, if that's the chair's intent to do. And we haven't gotten clarification of whether or not you or the majority party will even offer an offset for the repeal of this provision. Now, I'll support the legislation initially today, but with the proviso that hopefully we're going to have a reasonable offset to replace the revenue that we're missing from it. And what made the Affordable Care Act so difficult to pass to begin with is the President made clear, and everyone who supported it agreed, it had to be paid for. It wasn't going to add to the deficit. And that's why when the Congressional Budget Office scored the Affordable Care Act, they found that it would reduce the deficit by over $180 billion in the first 10 years and by $1.2 trillion over 20 years, because it was paid for, and it was the right thing to do. And items like this is what paying for things look like around here, which oftentimes isn't that palatable, and it's not very comforting knowing that we have to do it, but it's the right thing to do in light of the large structural budget deficits that we're facing today. I mean, there are still members of this committee that supported the largest expansion of Medicare with the passage of the prescription drug bill back in '04, and not a nickel of it was paid for. And now they're running around today scratching their head, wondering why we're dealing with huge budget deficits today. That adds to the structural deficits that are going on year after year because of decisions that were made not to pay for things in this committee or in previous Congresses that we're living with the consequences today. So I hope we're not going down this road now of trying to piecemeal repealing items that were used to pay for the Affordable Care Act, but without finding reasonable alternatives to replace it with, which will only compound the deficit problem that we're wrestling with. And Mr. Barthow, I have a question for you, whether or not this excise tax has a different impact between the device manufacturers, large or smaller. Because I've been hearing a lot from the smaller manufacturers in particular that this is a particularly unpleasant provision that they're wrestling with right now. Is there some economic disparate impact that's affecting smaller manufacturers as opposed to the larger ones in the United States?
Mr. Kind, I'm not aware of a particular problem, large versus small. The issue that you might be hearing might go to the point that has been discussed, the extent to which the tax is passed forward into a final price that can be recovered may differ by product. And so if there are some for which the incidence is such that more of it may fall on the producer, those may be some of the smaller manufacturers you're hearing from. I don't know, and I don't think a general statement.
Well, let me ask you this. Mr. Neal made it clear in his statement earlier that there was an agreement that was reached. It was a negotiated agreement with the industry in that. But there seems to be some confusion in the committee of whether or not the Affordable Care Act is going to increase market expansion for the medical device industry with the entry of more people, more paying customers, but also, quite frankly, the aging population, those individuals entering Medicare in future years. So is the medical device industry looking at an expansion of market share through the Affordable Care Act?
Well, as I noted, and I won't attribute any percentage to the Affordable Care Act or not, I'll make two general points. One, to repeat, in the baseline projections that we've made in conjunction with the Congressional Budget Office are that this industry will continue to grow. The effect of the excise tax by raising prices discourages some use, and so it won't grow as rapidly. In terms of what drives the underlying growth, one factor can be aging population, another factor can be expansion of coverage. I don't have percentages as to which is which, and that would also tend to vary again by type of product.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Stark is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Barthold, for being here. Do you feel that the excise tax we're talking about would increase health insurance premiums?
As if we look at just the excise tax and nothing else that's going on, as noted in the earlier discussion, as a tax on the price of the good to the extent that it is borne by consumers, in other words, passed forward into the price of the good, that would mean that certain medical services that use devices, an artificial hip or what,
You're saying
be a
yes.
bit more expensive. Yes, okay, I'll get the yes, but that's the analysis that gets.
Does
there,
the
sir.
Affordable Care Act reduce health insurance premiums?
The Congressional Budget Office and our staff did some joint work that, again, you have to isolate what you mean by premium on a standard given package without expanding the services provided. If you brought in more of the uninsured and spread risk further, you would have a modest decline in insurance premiums.
Now, I gather that we're talking today about something that seems relatively unimportant when we haven't addressed the 27% cut in physicians' fees and a one-year freeze on preventing that cut would cost $30 billion. And there hasn't been any suggestion from my colleagues on the other side as to what we're going to do about that or how we're going to pay for it. So we're talking about $33 billion that you don't have any pay-fors for, and you can add another $26 billion if you want to extend the freeze on or extend the cost of this bill. So, I mean, why we're not dealing with the important things like cutting physician fees and piddling around with this stuff today just seems wrong-headed. We should deal with important issues, because if we don't deal with the physician fee cut, it's not going to make a whole hell of a lot of difference whether people can get medical devices or not. They won't know what to get because the doctors won't be seeing them. And I hope, Mr. Chairman, that we could change our direction here and deal with the important matters in a timely fashion. Yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Gerlach's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Mr. Barthold, if I heard you correctly, you're saying the cost estimate for the repeal of this tax is $29 billion over the next 20 years?
Over the next 10 years, sir, that's correct.
Or 10 years, excuse me, yes. I have a specific recollection during the debate on Obamacare a few years ago that the implementation of this tax on the industry would be $20 billion over 10 years, 20. Can you explain why your estimates now are a 50% higher cost on the industry than what was promoted by the proponents of this legislation just a few years ago?
Well, Mr. Gerlach, there's actually a simple explanation. Remember, I noted that this particular tax doesn't become effective until January of 2013.
Correct.
And when we analyze things, we look at 10-year budget periods for the Congress. So we were looking at a period where the first 2-3 years there was no tax. Now you're looking at a period where there will essentially be close to 10 full years of the tax, and so that's.
But there is no tax today.
There is no tax.
There's not one dime being collected from the industry today.
From this excise tax.
And if this Congress were to repeal this tax this year, there wouldn't be any revenue collected from this tax over any period of time. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
So we seem to have this mindset. The federal government, this $29 billion is already our money before the tax has even been put into effect, before one dime's been collected, and it can be repealed before the end of this year, and yet it's our $29 billion already, and we have to come up with a pay-for it. Is that really what is being talked about on the pay-for issue? So that's more of a rhetorical question, so you don't have to answer that. On the point that a few of our colleagues on the other side have just made in the last few minutes about this open and transparent process that was undertaken to get this agreement from the industry that it's okay to impose a 2.3% gross receipts tax, in essence. Everybody's on board. Everybody got in line. They came into the back room with those that developed the legislation. I'd like, if we could, to have entered on the record this October 13, 2009 letter by over 240 companies and organizations, medical device companies and organizations, that specifically indicated their opposition to the imposition of this tax before it was enacted by Congress and signed into law by the President, with a particular position that they were taking that, quote, this proposed tax will have a cascading effect on innovation, access, and employment in the industry. Should the device tax be implemented, the United States will lose its status as the global leader in this market. More companies will likely choose to commercialize their products overseas, and a healthy sector of the economy will falter with a reduction in the workforce levels and a decrease in well-paying jobs. This letter was sent to then Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Majority Leader Harry Reid in the Senate, and was a clear indication by hundreds of organizations and companies that they did not agree with the inclusion of this tax in Obamacare. So I'd like to have that entered in the record if I could, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.
As well as a second letter dated just May 31st of this year, also again by hundreds of companies and organizations, again appealing to Congress to repeal this device tax because of the extremely detrimental impact it's going to have on the industry and on health care generally. So I'd like to have that entered too, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.
Yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Doggett is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I don't believe that this legislation we're considering should come as a surprise to anyone. This House has been in session now for almost 24 hours, and no Republican has yet taken action until this committee began to attack the Affordable Health Care Act. And you just don't waste a day like that without an attack on the Affordable Health Care Act or an assault on women's health care or an attack on efforts to clean up our air that we breathe and the water that we drink. And so this is a natural process. And it is, of course, this particular legislation relates to a broader guiding principle of Republicans here than just affordable health care. It's the same principle that applies to public transportation and the highway bill. It is the same principle that applies to our national security. Until recently, when so many of them essentially gave up on public education, it was the same principle that applied to public education. They're for it. They want to see the new bridges. They want to see additional weapon systems. They want to see improvements in the quality of public education. They just don't believe in paying for it. And that's why we limp along from transportation bill extension to transportation bill extension, because we cannot get any kind of bipartisan agreement on how to finance these vital public programs. And the same is true of health care. And so today, we have not one but four bills, $42 billion in cuts in revenue, because they say they're for health care, they just don't believe in paying for the health care. I don't know about some of these provisions. I expect some of them would not have been my first choice for how to finance affordable health care, but it needed to be financed. There is no free lunch unless we continue borrowing from the Chinese and the Saudis. The House rules may not dictate and mandate that we have an offset for these various tax provisions that are being cut and revenues that are being reduced, but good judgment certainly does demand that. To suggest after they have cried all year long and before that, that our deficits are out of control and that we need to bring our budget into balance and that their solution is to add $42 billion in additional deficit and additional borrowing unless it is offset if it became law, is the height of irresponsibility. Now let's look specifically at health care and the much feared Obamacare, of which the worst feature is the Obama part, apparently. We got into the Affordable Health Care law as a reform because there is a health care crisis in this country, and it continues. Too many of our small businesses and our individuals are paying far too much for their health care and getting not enough of it. Just to give you one example of how the Affordable Health Care Act has affected Texas. Under Medicare, one of those much condemned government health care programs, the administrative costs run about 2%. In other words, about 2 cents out of every dollar going to the much feared government bureaucracy that efficiently administers the Medicare program. Under the Affordable Health Care Act, we put in a requirement that insurance companies that provide individual health care policies they are limited not to 2 cents, but to 20 cents. A very generous, indeed overly generous provision to those companies. I think it should have been a much higher requirement. But even at 20 cents of administration compared to 2 cents for Medicare, Texans recently received an announcement that our small businesses and individuals would receive $186 million in rebates because of overcharges, excess above the 80 cents in Texas alone. And that's true with many other places around the country. And of course, there are those many families who are just one accident on the way home tonight, one disease afflicting a child from finding themselves in bankruptcy, as millions of American families have found themselves because of the gaps in our health care policy. We know that we pay too much for health care in the United States relative to other countries, and we come out behind on so many leading health care indices. We pay too much and do not get the care that we need. And so we came forward with the Affordable Health Care Act, not the approach I would have taken. I wish we had a much more comprehensive and stronger health care act. No, President Obama turned to a middle ground. He took the idea that Governor Romney is no longer so proud of and accepted it as the middle ground, and these Republicans don't have an alternative that they have advanced, and they've now had 17 months to do it. All they offer is today's proposal to cut more.
Gentleman's correct. Mr. Thompson's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I think I agree with a lot of my Republican colleagues on the other side of this dais. I don't like this tax on the device manufacturers. I didn't like it when it was first put in place. As a matter of fact, during the health care reform work that we were doing, I met with a lot of the device manufacturers, tried to figure out how to mitigate some of the concerns that they raised. And we were all, and a lot of folks here worked on that, and we were able to come to an agreement to construct a medical device tax that worked. And as Mr. Levin pointed out, not only did it work, but it got the device manufacturers to agree that, in fact, we did need to impose this tax, and we did need to deal with health care reform, and they were very much a part of it. They signed that letter, and as a result, we got that health care reform. And if you look at this particular provision, it helped pass legislation, pay for legislation that was passed, that will increase by 30 million people the amount of folks who will be insured. And if you look at the RAND Corporation study, over a third of them are going to be within that age bracket where you're more apt to need a medical device than other folks. So they're actually going to benefit from this. And if you look specifically at the protections that it put in place, hearing aids, glasses, contact lenses, exempt. We heard a little bit about the retail provisions. Retail provisions say they're exempt, so you're not going to be paying a tax on Band-Aids or things that you buy over the counter. And it treated foreign manufacturers the same way. So there's nothing in this provision that's going to drive production overseas or disadvantage American producers. So by passing this bill without paying for it, I think we just go further down that slippery slope. And we've been going down it. Just before we went on the last break, we passed a bill that cut taxes to small businesses by 20% without paying for it. So we added that much more to the deficit, that much more to the debt. And in this committee, Mr. Chairman, you've come out with a suggestion or a goal of reducing tax rates to 25%. So the issues that we deal with regarding these tax provisions aren't going to become any easier. They're going to become more and more difficult. And I think it's a huge mistake to pass this bill without providing at least some idea of what that pay-for is going to look like. Because we've got a whole line of things that we'd all like to change, we'd all like to repeal, but without paying for them, it is the height of irresponsibility. So until we get some idea what that's going to look like, I think it's a real mistake to continue on this course.
Will the gentleman yield for just a minute?
I yield my time to Mr. Levin.
No one denies the importance of this industry, but I just want to present for our consideration a few facts. According to CRS, the top 10 device companies had 2011 net profits of $48 billion. And one study shows that the 10 largest medical device makers would have generated 86% of these excise taxes if they had been in effect the last year. So the issue isn't the importance of the medical device industry. The question is, there was an agreement reached, as you said, Mr. Thompson, and as Mr. Neal has explained. There was an agreement reached after considerable negotiation, and now what is being proposed without paying for it is a free pass.
If I reclaim my time, you're correct. And the fact that it was mentioned earlier that we're not collecting the tax now, somehow it doesn't exist. You know, you will be seeing ads in the next few months about buy now, furniture, cars, whatever, no payments until January. Here's a news flash. Come January, you still owe all the money that car or that furniture cost. So to be able to say that if we repeal it now, it never existed is more than or less than rhetorical.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson.
Mr. T-Berry is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I promised myself I wasn't going to speak, but I can't contain myself. The agreement. I have a constituent by the name of Wayne Pohl. Wayne Pohl's a doctor. He's a urologist. He founded a device several years ago from his days of doing surgery to make the surgery to remove a kidney less invasive. And he is a remarkable entrepreneur and physician who just started this company. He was not part of any agreement. And in fact, as a new medical device maker, this tax will hurt him more than apparently the people who made the agreement. And the jobs that potentially he can create and the unbelievable impact that this device that he is in the process of making will have on patient care. But he won't be able to do it as quickly because he won't make a profit for a while, but he'll be subject to the tax immediately. Let me just tell you, 15 days ago, I'm going to read this from the Dayton Business Journal. Quote, a new medical device tax to take hold next year could cost Ohio jobs and hinder innovation, says an industry leader within the state who's calling for its repeal. The tax would eliminate as many as 43,000 jobs, including some in Ohio, where more than 35,000 are employed within the medical technology industry. Bloomberg reported earlier this year, quote, earlier last year, Covidien Pick COV, maker of surgical instruments, said it would lay off 200 workers in the U.S. and move production to Costa Rica and Mexico. It too cited the tax for the reason. A study done by AvaMed, a trade association for the industry, claims that the tax could ultimately cost more than 45,000 jobs. That was reported in Bloomberg. In the Cleveland Plain Dealer, Tony Dennis, the president and CEO of BioOhio, quote, while the goal was to help pay for the legislation, its real impact is inhibiting job creation and innovation. Perhaps worst of all, the tax is applied to sales, not profits, of a medical device manufacturer. While still growing and creating jobs, more than a few Ohio medical device companies are not yet profitable. Under this tax, they would actually owe a hefty tax bill despite not having a penny in profits, particularly harmful for startups. Again, the Kalamazoo Gazette reported that a company called Stryker Corporation said it would look to cut its 20,000 worldwide workforce, including jobs in Ohio or jobs in America, because of the medical device tax. It could cost up to $150 million if Stryker does an across-the-board cut 2,250-person Kalamazoo area workforce, about 112 local workers would lose their jobs. Ladies and gentlemen, this is about jobs. Jobs. I toured a medical device facility in Ohio where this tax could cost nearly 1,000 jobs in America. Now, when you cut those jobs, those people don't have jobs. They're not paying taxes. They're not contributing. So some of the other side of the aisle may say this is not important, that this is a game, that this is an attack. This is about jobs. We have less jobs today, less people employed today in America, or excuse me, we have more people not employed today in America than when I was in high school. People want to work. And we're targeting an industry where the jobs are very good. Mr. Chairman, some of the issues brought up by folks on the other side are legitimate issues that we should deal with between now and this goes on the floor. But again, this majority is about creating jobs. And the chairman has been all over this issue about helping our economy. And make no mistake, the intent by the sponsor, the intent by the chairman, the intent by this majority is about jobs. I yield back.
Thank you. I think we have one final request, Mr. Lewis. Oh.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Right.
You recognizing me, Mr. Chairman? Well, thank you, Mr.
That's for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record a paper from the Center on Budget and Policy Priority entitled Excise Tax on Medical Devices Should Not Be Repealed.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, in all due respect, I just want to ask you a question. Why are you so reluctant to present to members of the committee the pay for it?
As I've said before, the House rules do not require that committees identify pay-fors on legislation, and we've discussed it pretty thoroughly at this hearing so far today, at this markup so far today. And I don't intend, if you asked me, and we'll finish very quickly, I don't intend to do so.
Well, and another time, during another period, on the other chair since I've been on this committee, we did have discussion, and we did come up with pay-for. Are you leaning toward the pay-fors coming from cooperation and high rollers, or would the pay-for come from low-income and middle-class people, affecting Meals on Wheels, Social Security, health insurance?
As I said, I'm not going to discuss that issue right now. Really, this is an appropriate time to ask any questions, technical questions of Mr. Barthold about the pending legislation before the committee.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, it's my feeling as a member of this committee that I think it's shameful that we're going down this road, and we're going to have a discussion, a debate on the floor, and not here in this small committee.
All right.
And I yield back my time.
Mr. Berg is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I couldn't sit still here. You know, North Dakota, I served as our economic development on our local board for about 10 years before I got involved in this job. And one of the niches, one of the things we looked at is how successful the medical devices were in Minnesota. I mean, these are great career jobs. They're creating all kinds of new wealth, and quite frankly, they're shipping these all over the world. I mean, it's an industry that's key for economic growth in America, and Minnesota's got it right. We looked at it really close. I come out here, and the number one thing is jobs. It is jobs. Someone told me one time that if you want to encourage something, you subsidize it, and if you want to discourage something, you tax it. Well, I understand the challenge in trying to pay for the Affordable Health Care Act, and certainly with the new CBO numbers, there's another $900 billion that needs to be offset somehow. But that's not what this debate is about. This debate is about this tax, and I think if it's about jobs, and that's what we need to do, this is kind of common sense. Our rate is the highest in the nation, or excuse me, in the world.
I mean, we all know that. We've struggled with that as a committee, Republicans and Democrats. We've struggled with how do we create American jobs? How do we grow our economy here? This is exactly how we grow our economy. We remove this tax. We encourage this industry to grow. We encourage this industry to create more American jobs. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
All right. Mr. McDermott?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to add into the record a report dated May 31st from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities that states the following. A much-cited 2011 study advanced by AdvaMed, an industry trade association, alleges that the tax would cause a 10% of device manufacturers to move offshore, leading to the loss of 43,000 jobs. Analysis by Bloomberg Government, and they're cited in this article, however, finds that the study is not credible. This is a straw man set up by industry. They paid for the study, and guess what it found? They're going to move offshore. Wow. I mean, we're talking about, well, it's obvious. We're 159 days from election. And everything in here is now election fodder. Doesn't have anything to do with the truth. You can say anything you want in a campaign, and that's what we're hearing here today. Now, this tax doesn't exist. So how anybody can tell you we're going to lose 43,000 jobs before it's even been put in, I don't have any idea, and Bloomberg says there's no credible evidence. What we can talk about is what taxes are, what we should be talking about is the taxes that are going to expire by the end of the year. All the taxes on individuals in this country that are going to expire. Are we talking about that? Are we talking about whether we should extend those or what? No, we're going to wait. We're going to talk about those sometime between now and the election so that we can put one another in a position to have a bad vote on whether or not you really want to deal with the deficit or you just want to dig a deeper hole. This is digging a deeper hole if you believe that the Accountable Care Act is going to be upheld by the Supreme Court in the next couple of weeks. I personally think the vote will be 6-3 in support of the President's bill. Now, if we waited until we had that word from the Supreme Court, then we could know whether this was ever going to take effect. One of the things that could come out of the Supreme Court is a total repeal of ACA. But no, we're doing it one little bit at a time because we want to have a press release for when we go home. We're all going to be home in the middle week in June. We spent 20 days in Congress. Actually, we spent 10 days in Congress in the month of May. 10 days in Washington, D.C. How do you solve the problems of this country if you're never here? And we're going to do the same in June, and we're going to do the same in July, and then we're going to go home and say, we saved you. Now, all this business about jobs is kind of, it's funny, really, to talk about we're for jobs when you have killed over and over and over every proposal for infrastructure money to put real jobs on the ground in this country. If you want to create jobs, then do it through infrastructure. You know you get living wage jobs out of that. But instead, we say we're going to create jobs by cutting taxes. Well, where are the jobs? You've been cutting taxes for the last 3 years. Where are the jobs? The President's proposals are never considered, but instead we say, let's cut taxes. We're saving 43,000 jobs. I can see the blurb that's coming out of every one of the Republican offices in the next week to their local newspapers. Today, I voted to save 43,000 jobs in the United States by cutting taxes. I mean, it's just predictable because it's only 159 days till election. So this is nonsense. It is not going to save jobs because you don't know what the impact is. And in fact, the evidence is that it doesn't lose jobs. It is really to gut what the President did for the American people. And if the Supreme Court takes that baby down, you are really going to have problems in here when you deal with pre-existing conditions and you deal with kids under the age of 26 that are now covered by their parents' program, and insurance companies don't have to have any limit on how much they take out in profits. If you think you got a problem today, you are going to have a real problem in about 2 weeks when the Supreme Court comes down with its decision. I would urge people to vote no on this until we see what the Supreme Court is going to do, and then we can have a rational discussion about what is the real world.
Time has expired. Mr. Larson's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Camp. Let me echo the sentiments of my colleagues here with respect to job creation. I appreciate some of the comments that were made, but the President has had a bill that's been before this Congress. You would think out of common courtesy, we would be taking the President's proposals up. Having said that, I think as well it's important to point out everyone here in this body is concerned about deficits. Job creation equals deficit reduction. This Congress is going to face a very serious challenge. Fortunately, we're going to wait until after the election until we really get down to business. It's something that everybody in this committee and in both bodies understands and knows, but we're going through some kind of kabuki dance while the American people suffer. We need to get serious about this and wake up to the daunting reality that's going to be facing us. And with that, the most important path forward is to create jobs, to put people back to work so that we can reduce the deficit. I'll yield my time to my dear friend from a neighboring community of Springfield, Mr. Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Chairman, one of the positions I think that needs to be emphasized here is that in developing the model of negotiation that we embraced to put together financing for the Affordable Care Act, we simply adopted the model that Republicans used and the former chairman of this committee used in using government to impact price as it related to pharma and the prescription drug benefit. That was fully negotiated with the industry. There was minimal participation on the floor of the House with any of us, and certainly very little in this committee. So to argue now, as Mr. Gerlach pointed out, in any negotiating posture, there's an opening position and there's a closing position. I wouldn't have expected the industry to say, oh, we can't wait until this tax is imposed. Instead, they said we oppose the tax and then negotiated it. That's generally the way negotiating takes place. But not to understate the fact that in this discussion, it clearly was the example that was used by the former majority and former chairman of this committee to negotiate with pharma that increased by almost 40 million people the Medicare prescription drug benefit opportunity. We did precisely the same thing, except we did it in full public view, including discussions and deliberations on the House floor. This was put forward in front of the American people through the committee process. It was fully vetted in the committee. It was negotiated with the industry. It was brought to the House floor, and it was passed.
I don't is seeking recognition. Are there any amendments to the legislation?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment.
Mr. Brady.
I reserve a point of order.
Gentleman may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment that I understand is not germane to the subject matter of the underlying bill, which is about the medical device tax, and I therefore intend to withdraw the proposed amendment. The amendment deals with another tax provision in Obamacare that could devastate innovative job creators and put breakthrough drug treatments out of reach of some patients. I'm specifically referring to the annual pharmaceutical tax and its exceedingly restrictive exclusion language on orphan drugs. The purpose of the amendment would be to ensure that all orphan drugs, those drugs known to treat only rare diseases, are excluded from this new tax and protect patients' access to treatment for rare diseases. This amendment is revenue neutral and, like H.R. 2672, enjoys bipartisan support. Since the 1980s, Congress has recognized the benefits of providing incentives for the development of effective and groundbreaking research that enhances and in some instances extends the lives of those battling rare diseases. One example is the orphan drug tax credit. And even the severely flawed Obamacare legislation included some language aimed at limiting new barriers inhibiting the development of orphan drugs. Unfortunately, the exclusion language in the current act has a glaring problem. Only those manufacturers of drugs having received the orphan drug tax credit can be excluded from paying the annual industry assessment. The problem is that not every therapy that is solely indicated for the treatment of an orphan disease has received the orphan drug tax credit. Therefore, by linking the exclusion to the orphan drug tax credit, some products indicated only for treating rare diseases will be subject to the tax. Therefore, the reality is that many orphan drugs will be subject to this tax, which was never the intent. Thus, Obamacare unintentionally creates differences among rare diseases and the treatments for them, and could potentially discourage future product development to treat these diseases. It's important to keep in mind that this proposal would not add costs to the taxpayer or the Treasury. It does not open the exemption to drugs indicated for non-orphan diseases. Rather, this is a narrow remedy consistent with decades of congressional practice. It would continue guaranteeing that patients with rare diseases have access to treatments. Furthermore, it would allow our life sciences companies to continue developing therapies that will hopefully lead to new, innovative treatments and add jobs to our economy. So I thank the Chairman for the opportunity to offer the amendment. I look forward to working with the Chairman and the rest of the committee on this as the process moves forward, and I hereby withdraw my amendment.
And I withdraw my point of order.
Thank you. The amendment is withdrawn, and I would just like to say to the gentleman that I appreciate the importance of encouraging research and innovation with respect to rare diseases and orphan drugs, and like the gentleman, I strongly support full repeal of Obamacare, partly because it could have a chilling effect on such innovation. I look forward to working with the gentleman to find ways to reduce the tax burden on those innovative companies that are finding treatments and cures for rare diseases. Are there any further amendments? If there are no further amendments, I will now recognize Mr. Herger for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, excuse me, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 436 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Herger? Aye. Mr. Herger, aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Brady? Aye. Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Nunez? Aye. Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Davis? Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani? Aye. Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach? Aye. Mr. Gerlach, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Aye. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith? Aye. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock? Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Mr. Berg? Mr. Berg, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel? Mr. Stark? Mr. Stark, no. Mr. McDermott? Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra? Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, aye. Mr. Pascrell? Ms. Berkeley? Ms. Berkeley, aye. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Ryan? Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, aye. Mr. Rangel? Mr. Pascrell? Chairman Camp? Chairman Camp, aye. chairman is not recorded. Mr. Ryan, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
23 ayes, 11 noes.
There being 23 ayes and 11 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 436 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. And without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 5842, the Restoring Access to Medication Act. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. Again, I will now turn to Mr. Barthold to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and I would ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The documents describing the legislation before you are JCX 46 and JCX 51. Very briefly, under present law, as modified by the Affordable Care Act, for years beginning after December 31st, 2010, the definition of medical care for purposes of exclusions of reimbursements under health flexible spending accounts, HSAs, health savings accounts, and Archer medical savings accounts generally excluded purchases of over-the-counter medications unless such medications were prescribed by a physician. The proposal repeals that change. Thus, such purchases of over-the-counter medications would be eligible medical expenses to be reimbursed under health flexible spending accounts, HSAs, and Archer MSAs. The proposal would be effective with respect to expenses incurred after December 31st, 2012, so beginning in 2013. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Ms. Jenkins is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Barthold. Prior to the President's health care law, the 33 million Americans with FSAs were able to use their FSA contributions for purchase of over-the-counter medications. Is that right?
Anybody with an FSA, yes, that's correct, Ms. Jenkins.
And is the same true for the millions of Americans with HSAs, HRAs, and MSAs?
Yes.
Okay, so unless these people were able to obtain a prescription from their physician for over-the-counter medications, they now have to use after-tax income for the purchases that they normally would have used.
That's correct, Ms. Jenkins.
Okay. So if they maintain the same purchasing patterns, would this increase their tax liability?
The effect of it being excludable from income under the FSA or HSA is to effectively lower the price on purchase by reducing an income tax liability. So under present law, the effect is to have a higher effective price.
A higher effective price through tax increases?
Through the present law, correct.
Okay. Is there any income limit as far as income limit on FSAs?
No, FSAs are not subject to any income limitation. They are provided through employers.
Okay, so even if you'd earn less than $200,000 if you're single, or $250,000 if you're married filing jointly, the limitations apply.
There is no income limitation. That's correct, Ms.
Okay, because back in 2009, President Obama promised not to support any tax increases on families earning under $250,000. Would it be fair to say that this policy would violate President Obama's pledge?
I really shouldn't assess pledges, but I'll say that there was no, the increase in tax, the revenue projected would come from families of all income ranges.
So the tax increase would be felt by those folks as well. The Joint Committee on Tax, their report on this new requirement prepared for our Oversight Committee back in April states that some argue, and I quote, "The societal costs of requiring individuals to order a prescription from a physician may result in unnecessary visits to a physician and thereby increase national health care cost." And as an example of how that rule might affect folks' health care choices, patients with acid reflux can take Prilosec, an over-the-counter drug that costs $40 for a month's supply, or Nexium, which is a prescription drug that costs $120 a month, and there are probably other options. But both of those drugs are made by the same company. For most people, Prilosec works just as well as the Nexium, I'm told. So under the President's health care law, if people were to continue to buy Prilosec and receive reimbursement from their FSA or HSA, they would need a prescription now from a physician?
In order to receive the tax benefit of an exclusion, that's correct, Ms. Jenkins.
Do you think that would discourage patients from just buying the cheaper alternative?
There's, as an economist, we always think that there's some price effect for some consumers.
How much would you estimate the cost to our healthcare system?
Ms. Jenkins, you're asking for a broader analysis that we haven't undertaken. I think we also noted at the time that there were some policy considerations, on sort of both sides of the issue.
Okay.
We haven't undertaken a full analysis of the sort that you're requesting.
Okay. Would it be possible that the increase in healthcare costs would exceed the $5 billion in revenue that the provision was scored to raise?
I wouldn't want to speculate, Ms. Jenkins. I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. I yield back.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Ms. Berkeley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. More than 35 million Americans participate in flexible spending accounts known as FSAs. These accounts allow plan participants to set aside their own dollars on a pre-tax basis to pay for health care expenses, giving individuals control over health care decisions and how to pay for that care. Requiring a prescription for over-the-counter medicines has serious unintended consequences on patients. Providing consumers with the ability to use their FSAs for over-the-counter medicines offers them affordable and convenient ways to address their health care needs, reducing extra costs associated with unnecessary doctor visits and lost time from work. Plan participants should have the ability to use the dollars they set aside for health care expenses to pay for the cost of over-the-counter medications. I support removing the restriction on over-the-counter medicines. I do hope that we could find a bipartisan offset for this bill when it comes to the House floor for a vote, but at this time I do support this and have sponsored this in the past, and I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Levin's recognized.
Let me just state my position. I very much respect, Mrs. Berkeley, your position on this, and I think there's some merit to it. But as someone who chaired this committee for a short time, who now serves as ranking, and who now remembers our struggles to find pay-fors, I'm going to vote against this because it's not paid for. To highlight the need for this committee to step up to the plate. I can remember sitting here as we struggled for pay-fors. Some of us who were on the committee then can remember it. I remember so vividly when Frank Guarini came up with a wonderful pay-for something else. And the then chairman of the committee said, that's such a brilliant idea, I'm going to use it to pay for something else. And we stole Frank's pay-for in order to pay for our provisions. And in this time of a major debt and deficit problem, I really think it is not responsible for this committee to pass bills without dealing with the issue of pay for, especially since so many of the pay-fors are within the jurisdiction of this committee. So I think we Democrats, some will vote for this. I, as ranking, will vote against it, not because I question the merits of this. I think there's something to be said for it, though I think we need to look more closely at FSAs. But as a matter of basic policy, I think it's a mistake for us to pass bills without paying for them. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Thompson's recognized.
Thank you. I want to tack on to what the ranking member said. There are a couple of these bills that I think are good public policy, and there's one in particular that I think how it's scored falls into the category of utterly ridiculous. I don't know how you can find a price tag on the rebatability of money paid in and not used. That seems kind of foolish to me. But we are where we are with the scoring process that we have. So I'm going to join the ranking member in opposing these bills, only because I think they're not paid for, and I think that's we've really let down our constituents bringing these things to a vote without trying to identify how we're going to be fiscally responsible and pay for them.
Thank you. I think Mr. Doggett has sought recognition, and I have Mr. Doggett, Mr. Reichert, and then Mr. Kind.
Mr. Chairman, I sought recognition because I view this as a historic moment, and I want to draw attention to it. It has now been almost 17 months since our Republican colleagues passed legislation to repeal the Affordable Health Care Act, and since they, a day later, approved the 12 platitudes, the 1.5-page bill that outlined that they weren't just for repeal, they were for repeal and replace, that they would have their own proposal to deal with the problems of tens of millions of Americans who cannot access health care, and a health care system in the United States where costs are spiraling out of control. Let it not be said that Republicans have not come forward with a piece of legislation on the replace side, because this legislation is the first time, I believe, in 17 months after passing the 12 platitudes through the House, that Republicans have come up with a proposal that purports to provide access to more health care services to some Americans. Admittedly, it will not come close to the Affordable Health Care Act, which would provide over 90% of American citizens who lack insurance coverage, the people that face personal bankruptcy from an accident or an unexpected illness. It won't provide them much coverage, but it will assure that people who get access to certain kind of over-the-counter medications will now have some tax savings with reference to those. I believe that we needed far more, but at least there is this 1.5-page, 2-page bill that after 17 months, there is something that Republicans are advancing. I don't know if this is their entire alternative to repealing the Affordable Health Care Act, which would do so much to help so many American families, would extend the solvency of the Medicare Trust Fund, is already meeting the prescription needs of so many seniors, but at least they're advancing something. I believe they have not advanced anything more than this one flimsy bill after 17 months because they don't have a better idea. Because addressing the needs on health care of our citizens is a difficult task. The Affordable Health Care Act is the compromise of a compromise of a compromise that began really as a Republican alternative to the Clinton health care measure. It is not as comprehensive as it should be. It's not as good as it should be. It's just so much better than a system that leaves tens of millions of American families facing the alternative of personal bankruptcy if they're faced with a medical crisis. And to offer this measure, which does so little for so few, as the only alternative to that, demonstrates the bankruptcy of ideas and alternatives being offered by our Republican colleagues. We face major issues in this country. There are no free lunches, though we were told for 8 years under the Bush-Cheney administration that almost everything was a free lunch. We need to address this health care crisis by strengthening and improving the weaknesses in the Affordable Health Care Act, and we need ideas from all sides, all parties, all philosophies, but this meager effort is not an alternative to the Affordable Health Care Act. The only alternatives being offered are platitudes, rhetoric, and empty promises. I yield back.
Mr. Reichert is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this markup. And I just sit through these hearings and can't help think every time the health care issue comes up that we've been here before. First, we're told that there's a compromise. I don't know if the Republicans were included in that compromise. I don't remember being included in any discussion or debate or compromise around this 2,700-page bill. Then we're told that we're going to have to read the bill to find out what's in it. That's then Speaker Pelosi making that statement. So now we're beginning to read the bill and we're discovering what's in it. So first we repealed the 1099 requirement, which the Democrats agreed was a requirement that also needed to be removed. Then the administration announces we can't afford the Class Act, so that won't be implemented either. So now we're reading further and we find that the Independent Payment Advisory Board has got some overreaching authority that needs to be addressed, and we repealed that portion of the health care law. So I'm here today to say that I'm happy that we're going through this process, because now we're reading this bill and we're finding these things, the 2.3% tax on medical devices and the restrictions on FSAs and HSAs. And after the health care law was passed, I introduced legislation that was called the Restoring Assistance for Families and Seniors Health Care Expenses Act. And that act would repeal this provision. And I've heard from many of my constituents who are really confused as to why their health care plan has changed, when again another promise was made by the Democrats and by the President. If you like your plan, you can keep it. Well, that's not exactly true. Many Americans today are relying on easy access to over-the-counter medications to assist with common ailments such as headaches and the common cold, and limitations are being discussed with no doubt. These limitations will no doubt raise our health care costs. So, Dr. Bartold, many in the health care community state that consumers purchasing over-the-counter medication under the new rules will have three choices. One is to seek an unnecessary doctor appointment and obtain a prescription. Two is just to forego treatment at all. And three is to purchase over-the-counter medication with after-tax dollars. Do you believe this is an accurate description of the options that are faced by Americans today?
Well, Mr. Reichert, if I could add one additional option for consideration. I mean, it is also the case that some people see a physician annually or biannually for some regular care, and so it would not necessarily be the case that someone has to make a special visit to their physician in order to receive a prescription for an over-the-counter medicine. But with that as another option, I think those would be the options. You can try and receive a prescription by either of those two means. You can purchase the medicine but not receive the tax benefit, and you always have the choice not to purchase the medicine. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your answer. And in my opinion, Mr. Chairman, this will raise the cost of health care and also cause some citizens here in America to change their health care plans. You bet.
Thank you. Mr. Kind is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief, but I can't speak for the other side, but I can speak for our side when I can say today that before passage of the Affordable Care Act, we did read the bill line by line, word for word, went through it as a caucus. Questions were asked, answers were given. It was fully published on the internet for days before there was any floor consideration. So the idea that you got to read it to find out what's in it is valid. We did read it. I don't know why the other side didn't at the time either, because quite frankly, a lot of the things that were in it, there was wide bipartisan agreement in the past for those type of provisions. But like any bill, when it comes up for passage, there are going to be elements of it that you didn't particularly care for, others that you feel strongly about that make sense. And these policy provisions involving FSAs and HSAs, I had some qualms about myself. So again, today, I'd be willing to advance these measures, but with the idea that we work together to find reasonable offsets in order to pay for it so we're not adding to the deficit. I am concerned, however, that the majority's track record on this is not particularly sterling. I mean, we just had an offset to deal with student loan interest rate hike that will occur in July that will affect childhood immunizations and breast cancer screening for women. And that's where the other side has gone to try to find other offsets, which are highly objectionable. My ask today of you, Mr. Chairman, and the committee as a whole is whether or not there's a chance for us to get together between now and floor action and to discuss some appropriate offsets to replace the lost revenue from the repeal of these measures so we can advance some of these things in a bipartisan fashion. You know, at the time of the passage of the Affordable Care Act, I told my constituents back home in western Wisconsin, people should not look at this bill as the end-all be-all when it comes to health reform, because it won't be. It is a vast experimentation as it's unfolding to better help us learn what's working and what isn't working in the healthcare industry, and then the ability to make adjustments along the way. And I still believe that today. There's going to have to be a lot of adjustments under the Affordable Care Act that we'll have to make as we learn more what is working and what isn't. And we have to have the ability to make adjustments along the way in order to make good policy around here. And so I don't have a problem going back and reviewing some of these provisions, so long as it's done in a fiscally responsible manner. Again, we had to figure out a way to pay for health care reform so it doesn't add to the deficit in the future. We did that. Now, if the other side wants to start repealing some of these measures, these pay-fors, fine. But let's come up with good, reasonable, bipartisan alternatives that we can embrace instead. And that's really going to be, I think, the challenge that we have moving forward. Because there are, and the other point I'd like to make, too, is I think the way we address the Affordable Care Act is the way we're going to have to address comprehensive deficit reduction, a grand bargain around here. Because under the Affordable Care Act, there were spending reductions that we went to, but also some revenue in order to pay for it. And every bipartisan commission, and Mr. Chairman, you served on one most recently, the Simpson-Bowles Commission, have reached the same conclusion. It's going to require some spending reductions and some revenue in order to get our long-term fiscal house put back in order. And that's exactly what we were doing under the Affordable Care Act. So the irony is that the ACA is ultimately going to have to be a model of how we deal with our longer-term structural deficits if we're going to have any progress on that front. So again, we've got time. I wish we were doing it in committee today, talking about alternative offsets to pay for this. We're not, and that's unfortunate, because there are going to be other consequences that come from those decisions. But I would hope that before floor action, there's a chance for us to work in a bipartisan fashion to come up with some alternative pay-fors and offsets in order to deal with these policy implications that are facing us today. And with that, I yield back.
Well, and I would just say to the gentleman that obviously over-the-counter medicines are the least costly alternative. And one of the reasons that these, I think, were in place before is to help keep unnecessary visits to the doctor down. And we know that if people are forced to get a prescription for their over-the-counter medicine, that's going to put a tremendous strain on our doctor visits and healthcare system. But physicians estimate that about 10% of their office visits are from minor ailments, and that if we could, they could effectively manage those with over-the-counter medicines. And if we did that, and even and that would be about 40 million appointments a year.
Well,
if we even stopped about half of those, that would save $5 billion a year, which more than offsets the cost of this bill. So unfortunately, this is a policy that actually increased costs, even though, with due respect to Mr. Barthold, repealing it has a so-called cost. Actually keeping it in place costs even more. So, you know, this is where I think this is a common sense, bipartisan approach that I'm hopeful that we can.
But the chairman would yield on that point.
Yes.
Again, you don't have any argument from me. I'm sympathetic to the arguments for repeal and that, but let us work, because of the scoring provisions around here and what CBO gives us credit for, we're going to have to try to find some offset in order to pay for it, hopefully in a bipartisan fashion. So again, we're not adding to the deficits as we're moving forward on these provisions. That's my main point.
All right, thank you. Mr. Becerra is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bartold, what's the cost of this proposal?
Mr. Becerra, we included our estimate as part of JCX 51, and it's $4 billion over the 10-year budget period.
And like the previous bill, this legislation also does not provide for a pay-for the $4 billion cost?
That was the point that Mr. Kind and Mr. Camp were just discussing, I believe.
So again, if this bill were to become law, it would add $4 billion to the deficit?
This bill in isolation, yes, sir.
My understanding is that the rough estimate is that there are about 1 in 7 Americans who are eligible and actually use a flexible spending account. I know we can't get accurate numbers, but is that about accurate?
Oh, that might be a reasonable estimate. I think the important point to note on the flexible spending accounts, of course, is that it's offered through an employer.
Employer, right. So if your employer offers it, and about 39% of employers we're told offer it, and about a third of those employees who work for employers who offer it actually use it, so that roughly speaking about 1 in 7 Americans takes advantage of a flexible spending account.
Right.
That's
probably fair.
So 6 out of 7 Americans don't have access to or take advantage of a flexible spending account.
That's correct, although I should note in terms of the legislation, it also applies to health savings accounts.
Understood.
Would, be in
so
conjunction with
if you
other care.
take into account, what we're talking about is a provision in the law that benefits only 1 in 7 Americans. And what it does is it allows 1 in 7 Americans to be able to take a tax break when they go to a store, pharmacy or a grocery store, buy an aspirin or buy a cold medication, buy other over-the-counter medications that they don't need a prescription for, and when they pay for it, they then get to write off the cost of that medication from their taxes. So 1 in 7 Americans gets to do that. 6 of 7 Americans don't get to do that. So this is a tax break that applies to only about 1 in 7 Americans at a cost of about $4 billion. And we're not told how it's paid for, so we're either adding to the deficit, so all Americans have to cover the cost of this tax break for 1 in 7 Americans, or we add to the deficit, which we're told over and over, day after day, is too large. Does anything in law today restrict an American from buying that over-the-counter medication with or without any of the provisions that are proposed today or already enacted in law through the landmark health reform?
Nothing that would affect any one of majority age, to the best of my knowledge, sir.
Right. So if you're over the age of 18, you can go into any pharmacy, any grocery store, pick up that Advil, pick up that aspirin, pick up the cold medication, the cough medication, and you can buy it. Nothing prohibits you from doing that today. The only difference is that for 1 in 7 Americans, they'll get to write off the cost of that medication from their taxes, while the 6 of the other 7 Americans do not. And this provision says give that 1 in 7 Americans a tax break that the other 6 out of 7 Americans would not get. And by the way, it's unpaid for, so all of America has to cover the cost of giving 1 in 7 Americans a tax break. I think it becomes very clear once again that it's great. All of us would love to do nothing but to give gifts to the American public with the taxpayer's dollar. And all of us would love to say we're doing everything for our constituents, including them let them write off the cost of their over-the-counter medication. But when you realize that you're doing this for only a small percentage of Americans, and by the way, most of those Americans are affluent Americans, then you realize that middle-class America, hardworking American families, are not going to be advantaged by this provision, but ultimately someone will have to pay the $4 billion cost of doing this. This is what is called, what the Bowles-Simpson Commission called a tax loophole. Maybe some people think it's worthwhile, and if we could pay for it, maybe it would be, as Mr. Kine pointed out. But there's no pay for, and what we're simply doing is adding another tax complexity to the tax code to benefit 1 in 7 Americans. Maybe some of us in this room are among those 1 in 7, but there's 6 out of every 7 Americans who would not get to take advantage of this, but may ultimately have to pay for the cost. And so therefore, I think it's unfortunate that the majority is not putting forward a bill and explaining how they would pay for the cost of this. I would yield back.
Mr. Barthold, just to clarify, FSAs are available to employees who have employer-provided health insurance, is it not? Are they not?
Actually, it's
a gateway to this provision.
It's a little broader than that, Mr. Chairman. You can, for example, in the House of Representatives, an employee can participate in the House flexible spending account without participating in the House health insurance. So an employer has to offer the health FSA as part of a health plan, but it doesn't absolutely have to be tied to employer-provided health by that employer.
But it is in
But
connection
that's the
with
common. That's
the
the
common connection
occurrence.
is there's employer-provided health insurance. So
That-
when we call
that's-
this a tax loophole, it's the same loophole that allows for employer-provided health
It's
insurance
employer
to be deductible,
it's
correct?
it's a form of employer-provided health care. That's correct, sir.
Exactly. So when we say this is 1 in 7, we're talking about the same people who have employer-provided health insurance for the most part.
In most cases.
For some
Mr. Chairman, if I could inquire.
I just wanted to clarify, you spent a lot of time on 1 in 7. I want people to understand who that 1 in 7 is.
Right.
They're people who have employer-provided health insurance.
Right, and if I could just add to the clarification to be sure it's we're as transparent as possible. Not every employer offers that opportunity, and of course, only about 1 of every 3 Americans who has employer-provided health insurance takes advantage of that particular provision under the flexible spending account. And so even those employees who do get their health care through an employer, their insurance through an employer, may not be benefiting from this.
Yes,
and
but
that's why you get the 1 in 7
tax loophole you described is employer-provided health insurance.
Right,
So-
and the reason I called it a tax loophole is because the Bowles-Simpson Commission described all tax expenditure programs as tax loopholes.
Okay, Ms. Black is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I was on the committee that did hear this in oversight, and it's very clear to me that as we look at policy and good policy that drives folks into more responsibility for their health care, the Affordable Care Act, which was intended to lower costs, this certainly is not a policy that is sending us in that direction. Because now we're going to require people who could normally just go into the drugstore and get something that their doctor has already recommended to them, doesn't need a prescription. Now we're going to have them give their doctor a call. We're going to take more family practice doctor time, which is already limited, and that's going to drive up the cost because obviously that physician is going to have to charge a price for coming in to see them. So as we look at this policy, we see that this policy does not drive what we want, and that is people taking more responsibility for their health care costs. The Affordable Care Act one of its intention was to lower the costs, and we see now that we're driving policy that's going to drive up the cost. So it just boggles my mind as we sit here and we talk about trying to save costs in health care. We're really just doing the opposite of that. Certainly, we're taking away what the whole intent of this is called a flexible savings account. We're taking the flexibility out of it. We're saying there is no more flexibility. And so as we move forward and we look at the policies, I really hope that we'll look at policies that do that drive down the cost rather than drive up the cost, and also put patients back into the seat of being the controllers of their own patient-centered health care. So I think I could not have said it any better than my chairman did about what's going to happen with our doctors and the costs and the time that it's going to take, and I yield back.
Blumenauer is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was saving my comments. My friend, Mr. Reichert, inspired me to maybe just refocus just for a moment, because I do think that it is important periodically for us to share our observations, our thoughts, our hopes, our memories. Mine are slightly different than Mr. Reichert's. The legislation that was ultimately enacted was not a bill that anybody would have designed, but was forced because of a collapse in the legislative process, particularly in the Senate, where the supermajority requirement meant that the only way we were going to make progress was by using a reconciliation process, and there were some things that I would have liked to have moved forward and refined if we were actually legislating. But there wasn't a lot of it, and now we're seeing even less. The majority elements, as my friend from Wisconsin pointed out, that were embodied in the Affordable Care Act, if one goes back, actually were bipartisan principles. Actually, many of them weren't partisan principles at all. They have been implemented in private clinics around the country, and certain governors, Republican and Democratic alike, have dealt with them. And these are the things that ultimately we are going to do as a country and as a society to get more value out of a hopelessly expensive and complex medical care system that provides, sadly, on average, worse health care than our competitor countries who pay far more. Some Americans get the best in the world, sadly not enough. We die sooner, we get sick more often, it takes us longer to get well. Some of these elements are already being implemented, and there is evidence that is encouraging in terms of the trend for health care costs, including, I might add, Medicare Advantage. The whole notion that the Independent Policy Advisory Board, IPAB, is some overarching, evil, appointed bureaucratic dictatorial group is given live by anybody who actually reads the bill, that it's an independent commission, provisions take place only if Congress fails in its responsibility, and even then has an opportunity to put in place something that would meet our objectives. The first bill today, frankly, didn't withstand independent scrutiny, and every member of this committee has access to alternative research that suggests that the concerns are overblown, that there is a level playing field, there's no reason for a migration of jobs, and that it was part of a larger compromise that was in fact implemented. All of these elements today are worthy of discussion, I suppose, and some of them with HSAs could be subject to some fine-tuning, but even the HSAs are part of a response, a complex, expensive response, because we don't have a functioning healthcare system. So we provided extra tax benefits for some people, and it requires a modest amount of sophistication and planning, but only to those who get employer-provided health care and those who chose to navigate it. But it's one of those layers of complexity in the tax system that speaks to the fact that we don't have a comprehensive, simple health care system in this country that's affordable, and so we carve it out. Well, I look forward to refinement. I am concerned that we are talking about adding about $40 billion to the deficit if for some reason these things were all put into effect, which they won't be. But this is part of this sort of the predictable political maneuvering that we're going to have to put up with for the next few months. I hope we reach a point where we are able to return to those bipartisan principles that were embodied in healthcare reform, that we start legislating again. Regardless of what happens with the Supreme Court, the American public, I think, deserves a partnership from us. This is sadly a reflection of political dysfunction, not healthcare reform, and it's very hard to support. I'm not going to ask Mr. Bartholt a question that he can't or shouldn't answer, but I appreciate the chance to share my observations, and I will yield back the remaining seconds of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Teaberry is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Baltard, about over a year ago, took my oldest daughter into her pediatrician, and after the visit, he asked me a question regarding the health care bill, and wanted to see if in that context you took this into account when you did the modeling of how much this cost. In a very nice way, he expressed a concern to me regarding this provision, the FSA, HSA provision that we're discussing here today. he said, do you understand, and do you people up there understand the impact that this is having in the real world? And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, the impact this is having in our offices here is the fact that patients who have HSAs and FSAs who now do not have the ability to use those by going to Walgreens or another pharmacy to pick up prescriptions, over-the-counter medications, are now coming in here, and the benefit for them to come in here is that they can get something equivalent of a prescription, ultimately with a copay and a prescription for me, cheaper than it would cost them to go and get an over-the-counter prescription, for instance, allergy medication. So ultimately, it's costing the system more money, costing me time and money, office time and money, and ultimately a script for a prescription drug. That wouldn't happen, didn't happen in most cases before the law passed, because they could just run to Walgreens, get an over-the-counter prescription, which they can still do, but today it costs more than it does now, because it could be charged off the FSA. Was that modeling done at all to show the inefficiencies of what's happening in the real world today?
Well, the answer to your question will be unsatisfactory, because it's some yes and some no. Okay. The yes part is in conjunction with the Congressional Budget Office, we try and project baseline activity. Now, baseline activity would include costs of care, costs that are incurred by physicians, the amount of time, the demand pressures on the system. So, to the extent that the provision in question is part of baseline law, those effects, we hope, are being picked up in the baseline projections. So the next step you're asking is, well, if we then change this piece, does our current estimate have have whatever savings there might be globally from, in the case of your pediatrician, providing him with some extra time, perhaps providing better care to someone who really needs it. And this estimate is narrow with respect only to the tax receipts effect of changing the excludability of these over-the-counter medications. So that's the no part of the answer. The yes part was the first.
And I understand what you're saying, but do you check with real-world folks, or is this kind of?
What I'm trying to say
here's my point.
is yes.
I met with the largest family practice in Central Ohio. It's one of the largest in Ohio, and they have been overwhelmed by this issue. And so we have suddenly so much more overutilization, and these doctors and nurses are saying, you people in Washington just don't get it. And this kind of reemphasizes that. I don't expect an answer. I think I know what I'm going to get. 33 million Americans, according to the IRS, are in FSAs. 33 million Americans are in families with FSAs. That is not just a tiny amount. And Mr. Chairman, a recent national survey of 331 large employers found that 70% of their FSA participants earn less than $100,000. An earlier survey said the average FSA enrollee had an annual income of $55,000. And by the way, the biggest reason that participants or potential recipients gave for not participating in an FSA, Mr. Chairman, was the fact that they were worried that they wouldn't use all the money and they would have to forfeit it. So rather than go the direction of getting more people into FSAs, we are actually going the opposite way of people controlling their own health care.
Thank you. Time's expired. I don't know that anyone is seeking recognition, so if there are no further questions, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no amendments, I will now recognize Mr. Herger for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, before we go to are we going to the vote?
Yes.
I'd like to, since we were using time, our questioning time, many of us used our time to question, and obviously a lot of folks used that time to also debate the matter, but we haven't had the usual 5-minute time allotted for debate, so I would like to be recognized. I probably won't use my 5 minutes for that, or either that or I would move to strike the last word.
Generally, we go to questioning, and the gentleman has had his 5 minutes, and then if there are no amendments, we go to the vote.
Right, in which case I would move to strike the last word.
I will recognize the gentleman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to use this time I have to just sort of point out how crazy this is. And I actually think my friend, Mr. T-Berry from Ohio, sort of galvanized this point about how crazy this works. Because of this tax break, which if indeed, as the gentleman mentioned, 33 million Americans take advantage of, which means that 280 million Americans don't get to take advantage of. But because of this tax loophole, you have Americans who want to reduce the cost of their medication. Don't blame them for that. If I could pay less for that over-the-counter medication, I would find a way to do that. And right now, because of this tax loophole that this bill would recreate, you would be able to take advantage of that tax loophole, the 33 or whatever number of million Americans out of the 310 million Americans in the country. Again, 280 million Americans don't have this issue, never get to take advantage of this tax loophole, and therefore the cost of their medication doesn't change. It's only for those 30-some-odd million Americans who'd get to take advantage of this tax loophole. But this is the crazy part about it. In order to be able to take advantage of the tax loophole today, there are Americans who are insisting of their physicians, pressing their physicians, lobbying their physicians to give them a prescription for things that they can buy themselves without having to go to a doctor. Please, Dr. Jones, give me a prescription so I can buy my Advil. Please, Dr. Smith, write out a prescription so I can go ahead and buy that Vicks Vapor Rub. Please, Dr. So-and-so, you get the point. There are consumers who are insisting of their physicians to write me a prescription so I could go buy this, even though I could buy it myself right now. Why? Because if I get your prescription and then I buy that medication, I get to take a tax break on the cost of that Advil, that Tums, whatever I buy, which 280 million Americans won't get to do. And so do I blame those 30 million Americans who would get to take advantage of that tax break? Absolutely not. You wouldn't be a smart consumer if you didn't try to reduce the cost of your health care if you didn't do that. But is it good policy? Is it the right way to incent people to behave, to go to your physician and insist that he or she give you a prescription, write out a prescription for something you don't need a prescription to buy yourself? No. Worse, we're trying to deal with this by adding $4 billion to the deficit or having to pay for it, and the majority won't tell us how they'll pay for it, so it could be coming out of Medicare. It could come out of services to others, seniors, or to students, who knows? But veterans, who knows how we would pay for this? But that's the lunacy of tax breaks and these tax loopholes, that you incent behavior by Americans that is not productive. And so I sympathize for the 30-some-odd million Americans who have FSAs, these flexible spending accounts, who want to figure out ways to be able to reduce their tax burden at the end of the year, something that the 280 million other Americans won't get to do. But I don't believe we should be doing this when it causes Americans all around to have to pay for this particular provision to benefit 1 in 7 Americans. And certainly because you see the kind of wacky behavior it incents. In fact, Mr. Bartolt's committee, the Joint Tax Committee, and he's the chief counsel of that committee, offered this, proposed a very similar provision as what is in law today, which this bill would overturn, which essentially says, don't have a provision that gives a fraction of Americans different treatment, better treatment when it comes to the purchase of their over-the-counter medication than it does for everyone else. It was one of many options that was made available by the Joint Tax Committee staff for members to consider. But even they opined that this is a provision that was worth removing. And so to now have legislation to restore it and not cover the cost is just once again to prove that if you push hard enough and lobby hard enough, you can get your tax break into the code, and it's your special population that will benefit at the expense of the rest of America. So I would hope that we would know that we can try to do health reform, but this is not a good way to do it. And with that, I would yield back.
Gentleman yields back. If there are no further amendments, I will now recognize Mr. Herger for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 5842 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I'm seeking recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Herger? Aye. Mr. Herger, aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Brady? Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan? Aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Aye. Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani? Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom? Aye. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach? Aye. Mr. Gerlach, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Aye. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith? Aye. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock? Ms. Jenkins? Aye. Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Mr. Berg? Aye. Mr. Berg, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed? Aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel? Mr. Stark? No. Mr. Stark, no. Mr. McDermott? Mr. Lewis? No. Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Neal? No. Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra? No. Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett? No. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? No. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? No. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Aye. Mr. Kind, aye. Mr. Pascrell? Ms. Berkeley? Aye. Ms. Berkeley, aye. Mr. Crowley? Aye. Mr. Crowley, aye. Mr. Johnson? Aye. Mr. Schock? Mr. Schock, aye. Mr. Rangel? Mr. McDermott? Mr. Pascrell? Chairman Camp?
Aye.
Chairman Camp, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
24 ayes, 9 noes.
There being 24 ayes and 9 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 5842 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 1004, the Medical FSA Improvement Act of 2011. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. Again, I'll now turn to Mr. Barthold to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and I would ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The documents relating to the bill before you are JCX 49 and JCX 54, describing the underlying bill and the chairman's amendment. In brief, under present law, employers may create a health FSA, a health flexible spending account, as a form of health coverage in which employees have the option to reduce current cash compensation and instead have the amount of the salary reduction contributions made available for use in reimbursing the employee for his or her medical expenses. A requirement of present law to be a qualified health FSA is that amounts remaining under a health FSA at the end of the plan year must be forfeited by the employee if unused. It's referred to as the use or lose it rule. These amounts must be at risk in order to qualify as a health plan. Under the proposal before you would permit up to $500 of unused balance to be taken as taxable compensation by the employee in the year following the close of the plan year. The proposal would be effective for plan years commencing after December 31st of 2012, so effective for plan years in 2013.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions for Mr. Barthold? Dr. Bustani is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Barthold, as I understand it, employees fund their FSAs with their own money. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Okay. And at the end of the year and the grace period, if there is one, any unused money is forfeited by the employee.
Correct. That's a requirement of present law to be a qualified flexible spending account.
And as I understand that the primary reason that joint tax assumes this policy will result in more reduction in revenue is that if adopted, those FSAs will be more likely to put, those with FSAs will be more likely to put their money in the account because they won't be as likely to lose the unused funds at the end of the year. Is that correct?
There are a couple of aspects to that, but that's primary feature is that people can be less conservative in planning how much to contribute to an FSA.
Okay. So you also assume that many more people will actually use more of their pre-tax earnings to pay out-of-pocket costs.
That was the note I was just saying about you could be less conservative, so you might put a little bit more in.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Chairman, given the high cost of health care today, every little bit helps. And whether it's being allowed to keep more money at the end of the year or contributing more to a tax-free FSA to purchase medical treatments, this seems to me to be common sense policy which would bring much needed help to families that are struggling with the cost of health care. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
All right, Mr. Larson's recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd like to just associate myself with the remarks of Dr. Bustani and say that I do think this is common sense. I would also add, I understand my colleagues' concerns about the pay for us, and I hope that we can work going forward on this. But I'd also raise the point again that several of members have raised with regard to the scoring on this issue. I quite don't understand that, but then again, there's a lot about scoring that sometimes seems to elude us. But I don't know if Mr. Barthold can tell us.
I'll try and briefly explain our analysis of this. There's two features, really two features, one of which I touched on with Dr. Bustani. Let me first address the other feature. Under present law, if there is an amount that would be forfeited, that remains in the hands of the employer. Now, a lot of employers are businesses, and so under present law, an amount that remains with the employer is part of the employer's taxable income. So as a baseline matter, that would generate tax revenues at the business level. If you then say you can convert this to let the employee take that amount into his income, it's compensation to the employee, deductible at the employer level, so there's no tax at the employer level. Yes, there would be tax at the employee level, but it's often the case that the employer has a higher marginal tax rate than does the employee. For example, if you're employed by a large corporation, a C corporation, the statutory marginal tax rate is generally 35%. Most individual taxpayers paying tax at a lesser rate. Now, not all employees work for people who are either profitable or, for example, myself, I work for the House of Representatives, for the Congress, so there's no tax.
You're impoverished.
Oh, that might be a separate issue. So that's factor one. So just automatically saying that, oh, this will become taxable income of the employee doesn't mean that there's positive revenue on net. It depends on the mix of what's happening with employers and employees and the different marginal tax rates. Then the second factor is the one that Dr. Bustani explored briefly, and that's the general incentive to say there's compensation of the employee at his or her option. A flexible spending account says turn what would otherwise be taxable compensation, my general wage, into a non-taxable health benefit. Well, that's sort of a pure revenue loss as a baseline matter. Under present law, as has been noted, some people are either reticent to participate in an FSA because they're worried about potentially not making full use of the money and forfeiting some, or they might be more conservative. Say, I will put in X amount of dollars because I'm worried about losing some if I put in a much greater amount. If you create a grace amount, which is the effect of the proposal, that should reduce some of that conservatism so that more people will participate and people who participate might contribute a little bit more. Now, I should note, under present law, there will be a $25 health FSA cap effective, so there is another factor in terms of how we estimated it. But it's those two factors, that it's, one, the interaction between employee and business and employer level tax rates, meaning that the conversion is not a pure positive, and the fact that if you make it more attractive for more people to participate and for those who participate to do more, that's a conversion of otherwise taxable income into a non-taxable fringe benefit, which is a pure negative. And that's the basis of our revenue analysis, sir.
All right. Thank you. I'm troubled by this score, too. And I have a problem with the fact that you score quite a large revenue loss from people who will be not forfeiting their FSA amount, and therefore they will not have there will not be a higher corporate income tax on the forfeited amount. But you don't seem to take into account any factor for people who will no longer be spending down their accounts to maybe fill up their medicine cabinets or buy prescription sunglasses, and therefore will take the income and actually have some income tax liability. So it seems to me that your analysis of personal behavior is all on the side to show revenue loss to the government, not on the side that actually people might use those extra $500 rather than making extraneous purposes to simply spend down the account. Do you have any concrete data on how many people in the last month spend down those accounts to get to zero so they don't use it or lose those dollars? I mean, do you really have concrete data on that? It seems to me that as much of this is as intuitive analysis as anything else, and I think there should be actually a relook at this score in its entirety.
Well, we will go back and I'll happily discuss it in greater detail with you or any of the members at any time. We do have data on which you see 5 to 10% of people end plan years with positive balances, leading to forfeitures of $200 to $400. And that's the basis of our analysis. I think the point that you raised is about how money may get spent as people spend it down. I think that is reflected in our current estimate. I think the second
What percentage of spending is in the last month? Or, frankly, many plans allow you to do it in the beginning of the next calendar year.
You can have under many plans, up to 2.5 months grace carryover. I don't have that
That might be an indication of how many people actually are making purchases that they might not otherwise make if they could take the cash, and therefore would pay income taxes, and therefore there wouldn't be this quote-unquote revenue loss at the level that is in your report.
I don't have that data at my hand, Mr. Chairman. I will speak with your staff about it.
Are there any further questions? Are there any amendments? There being no further amendments, I will recognize Mr. Herger for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 1004 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I would request recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Herger? Aye. Mr. Herger, aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Brady? Aye. Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Nunez? Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Davis? Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani? Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Gerlach? Mr. Gerlach, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock? Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Berg? Mr. Berg, aye. Ms. Black? Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Rangel? Mr. Stark? No. Mr. Stark, no. Mr. McDermott? Mr. Lewis? No. Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Neal? Aye. Mr. Neal, aye. Mr. Becerra? Mr. Doggett? No. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Aye. Mr. Larson, aye. Mr. Blumenauer? No. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Aye. Mr. Kind, aye. Mr. Pascrell? Ms. Berkeley? Aye. Ms. Berkeley, aye. Mr. Crowley? Aye. Mr. Crowley, aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Ryan? Aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Davis? Aye. Mr. Davis, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Marchant? Ms. Black? Mr. Levin? Mr. Rangel? Mr. McDermott? Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Becerra? Mr. Pascrell? Chairman Camp?
Aye.
Chairman Camp, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
23 ayes, 6 noes.
There being 23 ayes and 6 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 1004 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 5858 to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to improve health savings accounts and for other purposes. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. Again, I'll now turn to Mr. Barthold to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and I would ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation. Mr. Barthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The documents before you describing the bill before you are JCX 47, JCX 52, and the revenue table is JCX 53. There are 5 provisions. They all relate to health savings accounts. Just very quickly, under present law, an individual with a high deductible health plan is permitted to establish a health savings account. Contributions to the health savings account are subject to certain maximum annual contribution amounts. The first provision of the legislation before you relates also to a second provision of law, the Savers Credit. Under present law, a non-refundable tax credit for eligible taxpayers subject to adjusted gross income limits can be made for the taxpayers who contribute to certain savings accounts. The first provision of the bill would provide that deductible contributions to a health savings account made by a taxpayer and that salary reductions under a cafeteria plan made by the employer on behalf of the taxpayer to the HSA also qualify for the Savers Credit. The present law limit of $2,000 in terms of aggregate contributions both for health savings account purposes and qualified retirement savings account purposes would be binding for both contributions. The second provision of the legislation before you relates to when expenses can be claimed for reimbursement from a health savings account. In order for a distribution from a health savings account to be excludable as a payment of qualified medical expenses, the medical expense must be incurred on or after the date that the health savings account is established by the taxpayer. The provision of the legislation would permit that if a health savings account is established during the 60-day period beginning on the date in which the individual's coverage under the high deductible plan begins, then that would be treated as having established the health savings account at the same time as the high deductible plan, such that any expense incurred within that 60-day period is an eligible expense. The third provision relates to the so-called catch-up provisions which are permitted under present law to taxpayers over age 55. The annual contribution limit is increased by $1,000 for an individual who's attained to age 55. And the provision would permit that in the case of married taxpayers, both of whom are over age 55, the $1,000 contribution to which each is eligible could be made to one single health savings account. The fourth provision relates to certain veteran benefits. Under present law, an eligible individual for benefits under the Department of Veteran Affairs who has received certain benefits under a preceding 3-month period may not be eligible to make contributions to a health savings account because the individual will have been deemed to have been covered by a plan other than just the high deductible plan. Under the proposal, an individual would not fail to be treated as an eligible individual to make contributions to a health savings account for any period because of a VA benefit related to a service-connected disability. And the final provision relates to distributions in the case of certain early retirees. Under present law, payments for insurance generally are not qualified medical expenses that can be paid from a health savings account on a tax-free distribution basis. Under the proposal, in the case of a health savings account holder who is at least 55 years old but not yet 65 years old, qualified medical expenses would include coverage under a group health plan, in other words, an employer-sponsored plan, in which the health savings account holder is enrolled by reasons of having been a former employee or surviving spouse of a former employee. That brief description summarizes the 5 provisions before you. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Barthold. We'll move into questions. Mr. Herger is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthold, this legislation allows certain low and moderate income Americans to receive a saver's credit for contributions made to health savings accounts, just like they currently make for IRAs and 401ks. Are you familiar with any research as to whether the saver's credit is effective in encouraging these families to save more?
This isn't an area where there's really a lot of empirical research, Mr. Herger. I mean, there has been some work that's shown that there is some take-up rate, that individuals do participate by making use of the saver's credit. In theory, by increasing the after-tax rate of return, of course, it should encourage more saving.
So you'd say that at the end of the day, this policy would create incentives for low and moderate income Americans to save for their future medical expenses?
It does create that incentive, sir, yes.
Under the current law, how does receiving health care from the Department of Veterans Affairs affect eligibility to make tax-free contributions to a health savings account?
Well, the Internal Revenue Service has provided guidance that an eligible individual who's eligible for medical benefits under programs of the Department of Veteran Affairs, but who has not received any benefits during the preceding 3 months, is considered an eligible individual to make contributions for through a health savings account. However, such an individual is not eligible for any month if the individual has received VA medical benefits at any time during the previous 3 months, except for certain permissible coverages or certain preventive care. So that's the present law guidance that the IRS has offered with respect to people receiving benefits through the VA.
So how would H.R. 5858 affect this rule for veterans who are receiving care from the VA for injuries suffered in connection with their military service?
It would essentially say that that 3-month rule that I just described does not apply. That would be considered the same as permissible coverage or preventive care under present law, which means that the individual would be eligible to make health savings account contributions.
So the bill before us would make it easier for veterans who have been wounded in the line of duty to set aside savings for other medical expenses?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? If there are no further questions, are there any amendments? If there are no amendments, I will recognize Mr. Herger for the purposes of a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee favorably report H.R. 5858 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on adoption The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I request ayes and ayes.
A recorded vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Herger? Aye. Mr. Herger, aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Brady? Aye. Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Nunez? Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani? Mr. Roscom? Mr. Gerlach? Aye. Mr. Gerlach, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock? Ms. Jenkins? Oh, Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Berg? Mr. Berg, aye. Ms. Black? Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Rangel? Mr. Stark? No. Mr. Stark, no. Mr. McDermott? Mr. Lewis? No. Mr. Lewis, no. Mr. Neal? Mr. Becerra? Mr. Doggett? No. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? No. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Aye. Mr. Kind, aye. Mr. Pascrell? Ms. Berkeley? Yes. Ms. Berkeley, yes. Mr. Crowley? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Bustani? Aye. Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Marchant? Ms. Black? Mr. Levin? Mr. Rangel? Mr. McDermott? Mr. Neal? Mr. Becerra? Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Crowley? Chairman Camp?
Aye.
Chairman Camp, aye. The gentleman is not recorded. Mr. Schock, aye. The gentleman's not recorded. Mr. Roscom, the gentleman is not recorded. Aye. Mr. Roscom, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
21 to 7.
There being 21 ayes and 7 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 5858 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objections, members will have additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.